It gives me great pleasure today to welcome you to the first of a cycle of 3 lectures in memory of the late Professor of Civil Law at this university, Professor Alan Watson. As we all know, Alan was a remarkable scholar, a fine product of the Scottish education system, who after his doctorate at Oxford went on to have a stellar career, not just in Scotland, but latterly also in the United States. As a prolific writer with a wide-ranging intellectual set of interests, he became a true global ambassador, not just for Scotland, but also for Scots law. Alan's scholarship was permeated by 2 central ideas. The first idea is that current law cannot be understood properly without a fundamental appreciation of the history of the rules of law and also of the wider context. The second fundamental idea was that legal change is primarily driven by what he called the internal legal culture of the legal system rather than larger cultural forces per se. This latter point he explored in many books and articles through the label of legal transplants, as we all know. It is within this latter context that Alan explored the law relating to slavery, first in his book Slave Law in the Americas in 1990, and thereafter in another book, Roman Slave Law, published in 2004. Whenever one had a conversation with Alan about these 2 books, and I did on occasion, he was always at pains to point out that slavery as a legal category is highly problematic, doctrinally, socially, and morally. And although in 2019 we might fool ourselves into thinking that slavery is something that belongs in the distant past, rather, many of the scholarship contributions by colleagues of mine in international law today can attest that slavery, whether legal or economic, remains an invisible reality for many of the world. This is why it's so important that we return to the past, so that in the words of the Roman author Cicero, we do not remain children ignorant of what has come before. Our speaker today, John Cairns, Professor of Civil Law, needs little introduction. He is one of the foremost experts in the world history of Scots law in the 18th century and beyond, and he's also done, more than anyone, done work on the internal legal culture of Scots law from the 18th century onwards. He's also a pupil of Alan's, as we all know, and therefore is probably the best candidate to inaugurate this new series of lectures in the Centre for Legal History. Join me in welcoming him today for our first of 3 lectures.
Thank you, Paul, for that very kind remark. I'll just start off by saying it is 45 years ago that in this very lecture theatre I first encountered Alan Watson as I attended the class of first year civil law. He was Professor of Civil Law, as Paul said. He was a charismatic and mesmerising teacher who lectured towards the end of the course of civil law, focusing on the reception of Roman law, though he was an expert who had earlier specialised in the law of the later Roman Republic. I subsequently realised that his classes were based on the research he'd carried out for his then newest and now best-known book, Legal Transplants. Alan believed that the life of teaching research was not only a worthwhile one, but also an important one. It was a life that connected one both with the distant past. Through Alan, I'm able to trace my pedigree of teacher and pupil back to Irnerius in 12th century Bologna, and with the future with one's own pupils. In due course, Alan supervised my doctorate and became my friend. I'll just say he was not a paragon of virtue. He was mischievous. He had a love of gossip. And he was always clear about the importance of intellectual work as a good in itself, and the duty to contribute to it as best one could. I should also say he was great fun. Just under 20 years ago, Alan attended the inaugural lecture I gave in this very lecture theatre for my then Chair of Legal History. My topic was the Scottish law of slavery, a deliberately obscure and, I hoped, intriguing title. I succeeded to some extent in my deception, as I know some who attended thought I would, as an 18th century scholar, talk about miners and salters. But in fact, I talked about the holding of men and women of African, Indian, and Native American descent as enslaved in Scotland. I'd been gathering materials on this since the late 1980s. In those pre-PowerPoint days, I had overheads of advertisements from Scottish newspapers and photographic slides of portraits and gravestones. I told a story of Scotland and Empire, of men and women traded in Scotland, and of court cases. And these 3 lectures are in some way a development out of that lecture, which I've been slowly turning into a book that I intend to finish over the next year or so, if I'm hopeful. But as you can deduce, I feel, since I've been working on this for a very long time, I feel no need to rush. Alan himself was stressed. What is important is to play the long game. Now, this lecture is entitled Enslaved and Enslavers in Scotland. I shall just say a little about the terminology, as it's something that some individuals find troubling. There's, of course, no way around using terms to which some may understandably object, as one has to deal with source material and quote from it. There's also no way to avoid questions of race, as understood in the 18th century, terminology, and the use of physical descriptions we now find abhorrent. I mean, of course, we are free to judge the past, and cannot avoid doing so, but here I'm much more concerned to understand it, what they were trying to do. For this reason, I will not be regularly, for example, virtue signalling, as we say nowadays, my abhorrence of the material in the past, that I fail to condemn events and practices should not be taken as vice signalling, to adopt a term I recently heard used by my colleague Neil Walker. I would also say, if I had a historical credo, it would be that we best approach the big topics through the small, and it's the details and oddities that help us explain the past. It is also important to focus on people, as people, I think, make history. And the big events and structural changes are the product of human action or inaction, whether as individuals or in some collective way. Of course, this is a complex issue, but what I'm trying to say is this lecture is about individuals, as the title says, about the enslaved and the enslavers. We know little about the detail of the lives of very few black individuals in Scotland or Britain more generally in the 18th century. This is not because they were African or Indian, or because there's been some kind of attempt to conceal their existence, but simply because they were poor. And as Thomas Gray wrote, the annals of the poor are short and simple. More relevantly here, the poor leave minimal in the way of records behind them. We know quite a lot about the lives of exceptional black individuals, such as Olaudah Equiano and Ignatius Sancho, one of whom this probably is. But of others we know little. That black people in Britain in the 18th century were poor contributes very significantly to their invisibility. What this means is that from entries in a record, we get occasional glimpses of individuals, as there's a brief illumination of them, as an old-fashioned photograph, where a flashbulb goes off in the darkness and we see something. But then there's darkness again. Sometimes this entry into the record is a sign of something good in their life, and sometimes it's very manifestly of something not good in their life. Of things presumably good in their lives, one can point, for example, from their perspective certainly, to baptisms. The parish register, for example, in Ayr, records the baptism of Alexander Scotland in 1754, described as, and I quote, an Indian blackamoor, the property of Mr. Hugh McElwraith. In 1759, John Blair, the black servant of William Blair, was baptised in Annan. In 1765, Thomas Carlyle, the negro servant of Mr. Gordon of Greenlaw, was baptised in Crossmichael. But that, in fact, is really all we know of these individuals, who presumably shared the usual human lot of happiness and misery. I could list others, but this gives you a kind of flavour. But the interesting thing is these records require to be noted that the individual was black for us to recognise. So there's nothing particularly indicative of a name like John Blair or Carlyle. Although one has to say that adult baptism, of course, is very unusual in itself. Perhaps less welcome in terms of church records was the experience of John Blackastor, a black, as the record says, pursued by the Kirk Session of St. Cuthbert's for as they put it, carriage with a woman in another parish. At the end of life, one finds, for example, the parish burial record in Stirling of William Rind, black servant to Dr. William Rind. Another intriguing reference one finds in parish records is to Black James, to quote, known in fact as James Hamilton, described in the Lochwinnock Kirk session records as a heathen. Now, if one pursues the theme of archives, one finds black individuals appearing in legal records, such as Lachemo, a witness in a divorce case, as well as those individuals who turn up in the freedom cases, to which the final lecture of these three will be devoted. But we can note almost random things, such as an English probate record mentions one John Cleveland, a 7-year-old boy living in North Leith, who is the illegitimate mulatto, as they put it, son of William Cleveland, whose mother was described as Catherine Skinner, an intriguingly Scottish name, a native of the coast of Africa. Perhaps you can already start to see that African and Indian individuals turn up in archives of various types, mentioned, for example, in correspondence for a whole host of reasons. The black servant of a Jacobite from Jamaica ends up in Edinburgh Castle after the defeat at Culloden. Indeed, he is not the only black servant to a Jacobite whom one can trace in the 45. For years, one can follow Black Harry, as he is called, or Harry Gordon, through the records of the Gordon family as a servant to the Duke. He obviously ends up exercising some kind of relatively important post on the Gordon estates. But we also find things like Cato from Jamaica and Black Jamie from Virginia sent to be trained as wrights in Scotland, or young individuals imported either to be given as presents or to serve as page boys, as we shall see. But the major source of information is inevitably the newspapers. Sometimes one finds the report of a tragedy, such as the death of the black servant of a lady in Edinburgh, thrown and rolled on by his horse. Or the very odd story of the beautiful, and I quote, Indian woman, by which a First Nation person from what's now Canada is meant, captured at Lake Champlain during the 7 Years' War and consigned, as it says in the record, to Scotland to stay with the lady of an officer currently serving in America under General Amherst. It is tempting to suppose that, did she exist? One sometimes wonders with these stories in newspapers, but did she exist? She was or had been a slave, as there was an extensive Indian slavery in New France where Amherst was currently campaigning. Indeed, it is probable that a persistently absconding Native American boy in Glasgow in the 1760s had also been acquired during the conquest of New France. But the most significant source of information in newspapers is the advertising for runaways. For a variety of reasons, which I won't explain, I'll just leave that. I prefer to be imprecise here, and to say that I can trace between 40 and 50 runaways in the Scottish newspapers up to the date of the decision in the famous case of Knight against Wedderburn in 1778. If you wish to attempt more precision, you can now use the Glasgow Runaways database. 9 of these runaways are described as East Indian, and only one is a woman. There are also 8 sale advertisements offering 9 individuals for sale, of whom one is a young woman with her child. It is possible that one of these sale advertisements is in fact from a young man from India. These advertisements present problems as a source. The runaways are almost all males and in their teens. It is also unclear how typical they are of the individuals in Scotland of African and Indian descent. Are they simply boys who abscond under the pressures of adolescence? One suspects, however, that they are representative in one way in being primarily male. The research of Susan Myers in England shows that the African individuals she studies in England, where she can produce a much better data set, are overwhelmingly male. But as a source, the advertisements are invaluable. Even if they present problems, as they offer descriptions of runaways, often indicate what they were employed to do, and if being sold, what were their special skills. This has given you a flavour of the main sources used to develop this in subsequent lectures, and a taste of what one finds. No individual in Scotland of Indian or African origin in the 18th century has left much information behind him or her, Just these fleeting glimpses, these snapshots of a life that we suddenly see. But if one starts to look at them collectively as a whole, one starts to have a sense of their lives, and that is what I propose to do in the rest of the lecture, and look at the lives of the people who claimed them as enslaved. I shall start with one intriguing and difficult issue, which I'm always asked about: numbers. How many men and women of African and Indian descent were there in 18th century Scotland? It is impossible to answer this question with any certainty. I keep adding more and more to a list. I've now reached 130 individuals over the 18th century who are clearly either African or Indian. There are some ambiguities because of the Scottish liking to use the term black to describe someone who is dark. But there's certainly 130. But always remember, these are just the men and women who turn up in the records. And usually, as I've said, sometimes for presumably a good reason, but usually for a bad reason. They're being sold, they've run away, or they're being prosecuted for fornication by the Kirk session. What's more interesting, I think, rather than look at overall numbers, which we will never know, is to look at a pattern. And if you look at my sources, I stop at 1780 for a variety of reasons, you see this growth of people turning up in records in Scotland. From 1 in 71 to 7010, and one just knows there are more people of African origin, particularly in Scotland then, to 45. So this is just the kind of tip, presumably, of an iceberg in some kind of way. And if one makes a comparison with England, Kathleen Chater in her research has shown an exactly the same pattern in England with her much bigger data set. You see a growth like that of individuals who are African or Indian. Well, she focuses on African, entirely African in England. Secondly, although I don't have a slide for this, people from the Indian subcontinent, or could be from India, could refer to what we now think of as Indonesia as well. People from Indonesia and India start to show up in numbers and records from the 1760s. There's, well, I have a slide, but you find one in 1740, a few more in 1750, and then 1760. There may be about 10. 13 in all I can trace, not a large number. All of this reflects the acceleration, first of all, of Scottish participation in the British Empire and that empire's development, and particularly after the 7 Years' War, in which Britain had been successful. I should also point out the number of these men and women are transients, are clearly transients. In Scotland, temporarily, most notably the black sailors who turn up, significant numbers of people of African origin, served in both the Royal Navy and in the British Merchant Marine. And also one finds quite a number of musicians, black musicians in the army. Now, it's important to stress that of my 130 and of the unknown others, they were not all enslaved. They were not all held as enslaved. It is clear that many are free servants who have simply engaged themselves to earn a living. Kathleen Chater has recently suggested that in England many of those previously thought of as enslaved were in fact not. I'm not going to comment on her analysis of the English evidence, but I'll just mention this to indicate that many of the individuals with whom I'm concerned here are explicitly described as slaves, or explicitly described as property, or discussed using language of ownership. There's a lack of ambiguity in many of these situations, but some things are ambiguous, I'll agree there. And there's some ambiguity. In other words, people are some clearly just servants who've engaged themselves. People of African origin who've just ended up in Scotland somehow. I shall not discuss the development of the Scots role in the empire in these years. It is well enough known, and a kind of older historiography is gradually being replaced. But it is worth noting the extensive Scottish participation in the slave trade, if not generally from Scottish ports, extensive Scottish investment in the Caribbean, and extensive Scottish involvement in Italy, promoted through the patronage system by which Britain was governed. Scots of all social classes sought to advance in their lives through the colonies. Some Scots, such as Richard Oswald or Sir Alexander Grant, became major merchants, trading globally through London in the world. But if one looks, just to give you, I'm not going to discuss these, but to give some indications of Scottish participation in the empire. This is drawn from a variety of sources. This is not my research, of course. As you can see, particularly after the 1760s, an increasing involvement of Scots in the empire, and notably in parts of the empire where slavery is the norm. Now, all these links created networks between Scotland and the colonies of the empire, as well as between Scotland and Africa. These connections provided the route into Britain for many individuals of African and Indian origin. Indeed, they provided the potential route out of Scotland for Scots, such as, for example, we know that Robert Burns, relying on patronage networks with which he was involved, of people in Ayrshire, intended to go to work in Jamaica. But the networks are very important. It's down these networks that people of African and Indian origin come. Now, this raises a number of interesting questions. Who are these men and women? Or, in fact, as many of them were, children. What did they do? For whom were they servants? Or who claimed them as enslaved? What were their relationships and attitudes? How can we consider their integration into, such as there was, if any, into Scottish society? These are big questions which I'm only able to touch on. And I shall, because I can't deal with this type of matter in any statistical way, I shall give you an interpretive overview with some examples. Well, who were they? And that's an important question, I think, and I'll start with that. In the period with which we are concerned, I think it is fair to assume that all the individuals of Indian descent had come from there, having been relatively recently brought to Scotland, whether as enslaved or free servants. This, for example, is certainly the case for Molly and Bell from Bengal, who are found in Perthshire in 1770, described as slaves or servants in a court record. Neither of them, interestingly enough, spoke any English. One assumes the same for Sir Hector Munro's Bengali cook, Caesar, who runs away from in Rossshire in the 1770s. Of those of African descent, the route to Scotland could be more complicated. 7 of my individuals are explicitly described as born in Africa, or as natives of Africa. Some, of course, may have come directly to Scotland from Africa, brought by the many Scots who lived and worked on the Guinea coast. One should probably also assume that those described as having, in an advertisement in some way, as having ritually scarified on their cheeks, have probably been brought up in Africa to have had their nation's ritual scarification. They've reached that age for that before they've ended up in Scotland. But where we find details, a common route into Scotland is, of course, through the Caribbean or the North American colonies. This is so, of course, for famous Joseph Knight and for a man called Charles Murray, described in his tombstone in Repentance Tower in Dumfriesshire as Charles Murray, native of Africa, servant to Mr. Charles Murray of Murraythwaite. Sometimes the colony is specified, sometimes it is not. Some specifications are very general. One finds Cato, described as, quote, an American blackfellow in 1744. And in 1769, a 15-year-old runaway called James is sought, advertised for as an American black boy. James Montgomery was a Virginia-born slave. Also from the Chesapeake region was Anne, probably from Maryland, who runs away and who's wearing a slave collar. Peggy, a domestic slave, was from Charleston in South Carolina. 11-year-old Luck came from Virginia, North Carolina region. Also from North Carolina was Cupid, born at Cape Fear, and an unnamed 11-year-old boy offered for sale in Edinburgh in 1766. And we also find a slave woman from Charleston, is sent to live in Dumfries in 1777. And we find other descriptions, such as William of Northumberland is described as having recently come from South Carolina with his owner. David Spence came to Scotland from Grenada. Cambridge was sent to Scotland from Nevis in 1711. In 1727, William McDowell, a famous man, asked for a slave boy to be sent to Glasgow. He would presumably either have come from Nevis or St Kitts, where McDowell had links. Or another a young man called Cato, who was sent by his master from Jamaica to Scotland in 1734. Now, all of that listing just indicates what I've indicated, that the people tend to come in from colonies where you find Scots active, which of course is exactly what one would expect. It's nothing unusual in that. And for those about whom we know nothing, one can probably assume the same. But of course, the routes to Scotland could be more complicated, involving the Indian slave trade of New France, as for Bob, a runaway in Glasgow. Also, William Cullen, in his medical lectures, describes his treatment of a mute called John Baptist in the early 1770s. Now, John Baptist is not someone who's been given a name, that name, by Protestant Britain. That's obviously someone who was originally a Jean-Baptiste or a Juan Batista, who has come into possession of someone in Britain, and ended up in Edinburgh. After one finds people in Scotland of African and Indian origin throughout the country, from Shetland to Stranraer. I'll just give a little listing of names just to indicate. Alloa, Appin, Arbroath, Atholl, Ayr, Burntisland, Dalkeith, Dumfriesshire, Edinburgh, including Canongate in the suburbs, Fife, Glasgow, Greenock, Inverary, the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright, Linlithgow, Murray, the Orkneys, Perthshire, Port Glasgow, Rossshire, Speyside, Stirling, Wemyss and Wigtonshire. You find them in all of these areas. And some of them, of course, far more. I'm not talking, for many of them, not just one individual. Of course, it's quite a large number in some instances. Well, if we know where these men and women are coming from, and we know where they end up, the question is, how did they get here? Because one suspects it is always feasible that some may have come on their own, as a sailor, for example, but one suspects that many of these men and women will have accompanied masters and mistresses to Scotland as servants. And one thing it's difficult sometimes for us in the modern world to realize that this is a world of servants. Servants are necessary. Everyone needs servants. Even servants have servants, because life is complex, and there aren't all the easy facilities of the modern world. This seems pretty obvious, but it's worth stressing because people don't really realize this, that when doing laundry is a major task, you need servants to help you do it. When you wear very elaborate clothes of the 18th century, you need servants to help you into them. So servants are a necessity of life in a way that we find very strange in our world of ease and comfort. And of course, in some parts of the world, servants are normally enslaved in the British Empire. And we also find other interesting things. We find one example, a man called Black Tom, who was later baptized as David Spence, who is purchased by a doctor, a Scottish doctor in the Caribbean, who is dying, who wants to go home to die, to accompany him on the ship, because he needs a servant. And of course, he's in the Caribbean. He might have found someone else, but the simple thing for him to do is to purchase a servant to help him on his journey. Some individuals we find are sent as gifts. For example, a little black gentleman, a native of Africa, to quote, was sent to Ludovic Grant to serve his wife. Cambridge was sent from Nevis to Scotland as a gift. Scipio Kennedy, who is a well-known man, was probably a wedding gift for Sir John and Lady Kennedy. In 1727, when William McDowell asked for, and I quote, a good, handsome Negro boy about 10 years old, end quote, to be sent to Glasgow, he intended to gift him to a relative. Frederick came from and here, when confined, Frederick came from the colonies, ordered in 1762 from the merchant and slave dealer, minor in a slim minor way, John Watt, father of James, who works in Greenock, by James Brodie of Brodie for his mother, the Lady Spiney, as an enslaved black servant. This is where, of course, Frederick ends up. And you can trace the various receipts and the listing of his goods. So he's been imported as a servant. Now, what did all these mainly young men do becomes an interesting question. It is evident that many of the younger boys were page boys, intended to serve on a woman or a young privileged child. William McDowell again advised his wife to bring to Scotland, and I quote, "a boy to wait at yourself, and one to go to school with Billy," who was their son. So that she wants 2 page boys, one for his wife and one for his son. The boy sent to Lady Margaret Ogilvy, wife of Ludovic Grant, is obviously meant as a page boy, or the boy sent from Nevis for the 8-year-old son of the Duke of Hamilton. And of course, it is in this role that many very young males are depicted in portraits, often wearing a bit of fanciful, exotic dress. Now, of course, children grow up, and presumably such youngsters move to other roles in service as they age and acquired greater skills and experience. One finds, for example, and I quote, "the handsome black boy," end quote, of 13, offered for sale in 1769, was described, and I quote again, "very well qualified for making a household servant, serving at table well, etc. A 16-year-old could shave and dress a little, and had been for these several years accustomed to serve a single gentleman both abroad and at home. Another, aged between 17 and 18, had been bred from his infancy to shave and dress a gentleman." And when Captain Abercrombie in Broughton proposed to sell his black boy, he was described as being able to dress hair and take care of a horse indifferently. 2 skills, not only obviously useful in the as servant of a military man, but which also broadened the potential market for his sale. And the emphasis, of course, on shaving a gentleman is quite important if you think, first of all, of the old-fashioned cutthroat razors, but also if you think of the wearing of wigs, and tight-fitting wigs required your head to be shaved. There was indeed disputes between the barbers and hairdressers of Edinburgh over entitlement to shave because of these reasons. Many of the runaways in their later teens are described as wearing very elaborate and what must have been very, very expensive clothes. And one assumes they were intended to act as a footman or to serve their master or mistress in a public fashion. These are individuals for display. There are many, many examples of this in the descriptions of runaways, but I'll just give you one out of the examples. I quote, "an East India Negro lad," end quote, was described as in 1773 as wearing, and it's a lengthy quotation, so bear with me, "a brown cloth short coat with brass buttons, mounted with black and yellow buttonholes, breeches of the same, and a yellow vest with black and yellow lace, with a brown duffel surtout coat with a yellow lining and metal buttons, grey and white marled stockings, a fine English hat with yellow lining, having a gold loop and tassel, and double gilded button." This was a display. This was a very elaborately dressed young man. But you do correspondingly find individuals who are very plainly indeed, or indeed poorly dressed, such as Sam, who runs away in Athol, who wears a short grey coat, grey vest, grey breeches with neither stockings nor shoes when he absconds in 1765. Bob, the absconding North American Indian boy, as he's described in one advert, was also barefooted and bare-legged. He was very shabbily attired, and his brown coat and vest are described as much worn, and his hat as much cut. And so whatever these 2 young men were doing, Sam and Bob, they're not objects of luxury and display like the very elaborate servant. This, of course, is a highly gendered world of work and behaviour and resort. It is no surprise to find that Peggy, I'll just give one advert, Peggy who's advertised for sale in Edinburgh in 1766, is described as an exceeding good housewench and washer and dresser, and is very tender and careful of children. So her roles are very clearly specified as those appropriate for a female. And so presumably were those of the other, of the runaway Anne, who runs away from Dalkeith, and Bell and Molly, Bengali slaves in Perthshire, were presumably also general household slaves in some time. But they had the limitation, of course, that they spoke no English. And one finds an enslaved woman called Betty Marlborough, who attends a young child as her nurse, all the way from the East India Company's Fort Marlborough and Bengkulu in Sumatra, all the way to Dunbar in Scotland, and then she goes all the way back. An enormous journey. Of course, the roles of page boy and liveried servant for black men are cliches of the period. And it's probably because of their regular presence in portraits all over 18th century Europe, it becomes that we think often of people of African or Indian descent as liveried servants for display, because this is where they often occur in portraits. Indeed, it may be that in some of the portraits, they're even no more in reality in existence than the red velvet cloth or the vase they're put in as a conceit to support the grandeur of the sitter, in fact. But it's an interesting cliche. It's a cliche given a very interesting twist by the art of William Hogarth. If you look at Hogarth, who paints a lot of people of African origin, and his representations of them are very, very interesting indeed. And one of the reasons, if I just go back, one of the reasons why this portrait, whether or not, it doesn't matter whether he's Olaudah Equiano or Ignatius Sancho, one of the reasons why I like it is because he's not in the role of a servant. He is painted as a gentleman wearing rich clothes, looking directly at you. He's not in a subservient role. And that, I think, is one of the interesting aspects of this portrait. It makes it rather an unusual one. Yep. But we also find in Scotland, as well as page boys and so on, men of African and Indian descent who were highly skilled workers and artisans. For example, Caesar, a black slave, a native of the East Indies, was bred a cook, a highly skilled trade. Cato from Jamaica and Jamie from Virginia were in Scotland to be trained as wrights. And I quote, the Negro man Cupid, born at Cape Fear in North Carolina, who absconded from his master in Greenock in 1756, was by trade a cooper. Again, a very highly skilled and highly valuable trade. Sylvester, described as a mulatto, was serving time as a joiner in Greenock when he runs away. And it may be one thinks of a progress from to such physical, valuable work from lighter, more domestic duties for these young men as they age and become stronger, more powerful, as their competency and skills become obvious. So, for example, there's a black boy offered for sale in 1771 who could not only shave and dress a gentleman, but, quotes, who had likewise been at the right business these 2 years and could saw with a whipsaw extremely well. And this is a skill much in demand in the colonies. A whipsaw is a very elaborate saw that two people need to use, and the use of it is skilled and difficult. So be trained to do it as give this person as a valuable and worthwhile skill. And it's possible that Black Harry on the Gordon estates starts as a page, but he obviously develops into a servant of greater significance because you can trace him to the records through accounts for his moving around this estate, obviously doing something. It's a bit mysterious, but he lives there for a long time and he's obviously keeping an eye on things for the factor of the Duke. He's got a responsible job. Finally, it's worth repeating that a number of men, such as William Northumberland, Bristol, and John Gillis, just to give some, were sailors. And as I said, several black musicians in the British Army turn up in Scotland. Well, if we turn from the enslaved to the enslavers, or just simply to the masters of those who are not enslaved, identification of the owners or masters of many of the slaves and servants of African and Indian descent is not possible, even when we have names. Either they are unnamed, or the information furnished is too slight to provide much to follow up. This in itself, of course, is rather suggestive about the spread of such servants through Scottish society, that we find them either working for or owned by people about whom we know little. Because while the annals of the poor are short and simple, the annals of the rich build up a big archive in general. To give an example, Mr. Naismith in Stranraer has a black boy called Marshall who runs away in 1774. But he is impossible to identify, Mr. Naismith. But he's given the honorific Mr., so he's someone of some substance. He could have been a gentleman living in Stranraer. Perhaps he's a merchant. We don't know. I can find nothing out about him. Even individuals look very promising for investigation, such as Murdoch Campbell of Rosend, which sounds with the territorial designation as if you're going to find something about, suddenly it all dissolves. Rosend is Rosend Castle in Burnt Island, isn't it? So he owns quite a substantial property, but he seems utterly mysterious. I can find no records of him whatsoever. And one finds other intriguing things like Mrs. Blair, gentlewoman, who lives for many years in Dixon's Close off the High Street in Edinburgh. You can trace her there in Dixon's Close. She has a black boy named Bacchus, and Bacchus runs away in 1764. We know a little about Bacchus other than his name. Well, we know nothing about Bacchus other than his name, that he runs away. But who is she? What was her background? How did she acquire the servant? Blair is a relatively common Scottish surname, of course, particularly in the West, although also found in Perthshire. But again, we find sometimes difficult to know anything about such individuals. Indeed, one can identify other people called Blair who have black servants or slaves, and so maybe she's related to them, who knows? It's very difficult to say. This said, it is possible to identify with certainty a number of the masters whom these men and women served, whether as free servants or as slaves. Many indeed can be shown as having very obvious imperial links, be they with India, the Caribbean, or mainland North America. For others, however, such links are not evident. But it's possible nonetheless, I think, to start to build up a picture of slave owners in Scotland. I won't go into this in detail. I see time passes on. But one finds military men and administrators in India with servants or slaves, such as Colonel, later General Sir Hector Munro of Novar, who makes a fortune in India and builds a fine new house at Novar, or John Johnston of Hangingshaw, later of Alva, who also returned from India with a great fortune and at least 2 slaves. It is also easy to point to men and women with interests in the plantation economies of the Caribbean and North American colonies. I've already mentioned the famous Colonel MacDowell of Castle Semple, plantation owner and great transatlantic merchant. John Wedderburn, the self-exiled Jacobite, acquired a plantation in Jamaica and became master of Joseph Knight, with whom he returned to Scotland. The family of Murraythwaite, we know, had tried to restore their fortunes through plantations and trade out of Charleston in South Carolina. This is no doubt how they acquired their servant, Charles Murray. Charles Werner Dunbar of Machermore brought home from Antigua, where his father had been a merchant plantation owner, his slave Jackie, whom he freed in 1771. The reasons to think that slave Jackie had been bought, as we noticed, as his boyhood companion. He takes him back to Scotland as presumably his only real friend, and then frees him. And so one also finds slaves or black servants in the possession of relatives of merchants and plantation owners. But some possessors of such free or enslaved servants have no obvious traceable links with the empire. But, of course, that may just be it's just difficult to treat them, and as one has seen with it was possible still to have a small market. There was obviously a very small market in slaves in Scotland. And as well as the advertisements, there is at least one example of an offer to sell in correspondence. But what one can say is that ownership of a black slave or possession of a black servant in Scotland often demonstrated involvement, even if relatively peripheral, in the complex networks of trading, family, military, administrative, and other links that Scots had created in America, the Caribbean, and India. Easy access to these networks across the Atlantic, around the Cape, provided easy access to such a servant. But the interesting thing is such networks permeated Scottish society. As many here will know, I'm interested in lawyers in 18th century Scotland. Colonel MacDowell is related to one Court of Session judge, Lord Bankton, and to a writer to the Signet, and it is probable that the 10-year-old boy he wanted his wife to send to him, that he's going to give as a gift, is probably either to the writer of the Signet or to Lord Bankton. It's unclear from the correspondence. Of course, it may never have happened, because this is correspondence. And indeed, most lawyers of any prominence in 18th century Scotland turn out to have close links to someone who owns slaves. This is an issue which I shall return in my next lecture. But of course, in reality, this is just another way of pointing out that the lawyers were drawn from the lesser landowning classes or the rich merchant classes, who are the type of people who invest in the Caribbean and who acquire plantations or acquire significant jobs in the East India Company. So it maybe doesn't tell us anything very much at all, other than lawyers were of their class and time. Now, there are many other topics I've not touched on, and to do so would have taken too long, even if I hadn't nearly started to blub. And the names of slaves, which is a very, very interesting term. You've already noticed there were several different Catos, but we can find Scipios, usually pronounced Scipios, Cupids, and so on, and that's a very interesting issue. But you also find people with African names in Scotland. Also interesting is the use of the term boy. Then there's the very interesting things about the nature of the physical descriptions in the advertisements as well, and because how Scots perceived people of Indian and African origin comes out in the advertisements. I mean, often focusing on hair and things like this. Often one of the ways where you can distinguish someone as either of Indian or of African descent is by the description of the hair. If you see Negro boy with long black straight hair, that is going to be someone who is Indian, whereas Africans are usually described as having wool rather than hair. But there's all kind of interesting things in how the perception of the other that one finds at the time. Now, one of the other interesting questions is, as I've said, we know so little, but there are hints about how people felt about their lot. And also, one assumes that runaways were not satisfied with their lot. If you are a young man in Ross-shire of Indian origin and you run away in 1772, you're obviously distressed, because you're not running into a place where you're easily going to find friends. There is something wrong in your life. And he was not a teenage boy. I think some of the teenage boys may be just pressures of adolescence, but this is a man in his 20s. Another interesting issue, as I've said, integration into a wider Scottish society. One assumes that baptism into the Church of Scotland is presumably evidence of this. And we find other interesting aspirations to belong. For example, I mentioned a runaway in Atholl. He's called Sam, which is either for Samuel or Sambo, it could be either. But he has taken to calling himself Donald. He calls himself Donald. He's adopted a Gaelic name for himself. And it's interesting to discover in the Virginia Gazette in 1775, so going back across the Atlantic, a runaway called Harry. He has been imported from Scotland. He's gone across the networks in the other direction. And he's gone from Scotland and is sought for by his new owner, who's bought him from a Scot who's taken him back. And he's described as being literate, so he obviously learned to read and write. He's probably joined the church as well in Scotland, one imagines. And he can also speak Scotch and sing Scotch songs. And that I find is quite interesting, the singing of the Scotch songs, because we're at the period where the rise of interest in ballad literature becomes a serious issue in the 1770s. And of course, one starts to think of the interest of composers and musicians in Scotch balladry in Europe more generally. One also finds that servants or slaves on baptism change their names. Now, often they've just had a single name, Cupid, Cato. But sometimes they just take a Christian name, literally a Christian name, and put it before their own name, or their current name. The good example of this that comes to my mind is famous Somerset, who in the English court case, who's owned by, or claimed to as owned by a Scot called Stuart from the Orkneys. And Somerset has always just been called Somerset. And like it's common for slaves to have place names, like London, many Londons, many Bristols. But he's been called Somerset. And when he's baptized in Holborn, he takes the name James as his Christian. He becomes James Somerset. You find these interesting things. But when you find a servant who completely rejects his old name, in some way decides not to become Tom, as in Black Tom, but to become David Spence, with a name with no relationship with the person who's claimed him as owned, there's something significant going on here. On the other hand, you've noticed I mentioned William Rind, servant to Dr. William Rind, or who's obviously been baptized in that name, so he's given Christian burial. Or Charles Murray, servant to Mr. Charles Murray. Or so one assumes there's some kind of identification there, and there's obviously not some that suggests, but maybe too much, that there is something important here. Now, the relationship between master or mistress and servant is a complex one. This is another issue in which information is slight. Scipio, or as he called himself, Scipio Kennedy, lived at Culzean and at a nearby farm to a great age. He was obviously treated with affection and care by the Kennedys of Culzean. As he was about 6 when he was presented to his mistress, one can understand she basically brought him up and she became very close to him. But this would not always be the case. And sometimes people became favourites, and being a favourite is not always a good thing to be, as James Somerset found out, or indeed, and as Joseph Knight found out, to be his favourite can cause problems. It's not always comfortable in a society with such strict hierarchy of rank as the 18th century Scotland. The impression that these are usually boys, the people are usually boys or young men who become young men, or young men who become adult men, raises the issue of sex and marriage. John Blackaster, whom I mentioned towards the beginning, is not the only person pursued before a Kirk session for fornication. Bell from Bengal has an illegitimate child and starts a tragedy. In a difficult life, individuals clearly sought such freedom, consolations, and pleasures as they could. But where we have information, we find eventual marriage. To give an example a bit beyond my period, when in 1790, a donor gives money to the prisoners in the toll booth in Edinburgh, the remaining balance is given, quotes, to a Negro who is confined for debt and has a family. And indeed, as Norma Myers has shown for England, this largely male population will have married into the servant class in which they found themselves. I shall just finish by mentioning Alan Watson again. He wrote 2 books on slavery, as Paul said, and one on slavery and law in ancient Rome, another entitled Slave Law in the Americas. He was always interested in my research in this field, and the next lecture in this short series, Managing the Enslaved, will be on a topic which I know he was very interested because I discussed it with often, was how you manage slavery in a legal system like Scotland. So, thank you for your attention.